Hello everyone. This is the first in a series of short lessons on the Keynesian model. So in this lesson, the first one, it's only about the fundamentals. There are no graphs in this lesson. There are no equations, just the basic concepts of what the Keynesian model is about. And then later there'll be one, a graphical representation, what sometimes the books call the Keynesian cross model. And then after that, one on the algebra of the simple Keynesian model, and maybe even later an algebra representation of a more complicated one. Okay, so let's get started. The Keynesian model is really all about aggregate demand. So what is aggregate demand? Well, aggregate is a summing up of stuff, so the aggregate demand is a summing up of all of the individual demands in the economy. It's an abstraction because if you think about it, what you're really adding up is, for example, my demand for what I might want for dinner this evening, or plus my demand for what I might want to do for entertainment, plus your demand, plus the demands of 320 million other Americans who might want to do one thing or another, all somehow added up. So it's as an empirical matter, it's an impossible thing, but it's a theoretical construct, aggregate demand. And then aggregate supply would be the total summing up of all the stuff produced in the economy. So one of the features of the Keynesian model is this willingness to accept the idea that we can add up everybody's individual demand and talk about a number like the aggregate demand in the economy. Some of the other models that we'll study reject that idea from the get-go and say, no, it's not really about that. Like there might be a demand for a certain kind of housing, but not a demand for clothes or whatever. But in the Keynesian model, all the demands are all added up. So next, they take these concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and they create three rules, and they go like this. If aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, then the economy is in equilibrium. So you could think of it like this, if you sort of abstract it down to a small firm. If the sales of a firm are exactly equal to the firm's production, then inventories kind of stay the same week after week, and the firm just goes along like it did the week before. It's in equilibrium. It's producing 100 units per week, for example, and it's selling 100 units per week. Its inventory stays the same, and all is good. But suppose a situation happens that aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. Then what happens? Well, when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, then inventories fall. Inventories fall, all right, because you're selling stuff faster than you're producing it. And then the production supervisors or the managers of those firms discover inventories are falling, and they will, according to Keynes, hire workers. Right? They will hire workers, and then of course those workers will have to be paid, so incomes will rise, and the economy grows. So again, if aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply across the whole economy, we're buying up things faster than they're being produced. Across the whole economy, inventories are falling. Production supervisors will walk through their warehouses, they'll see inventories are falling, and they'll respond by hiring workers. Some of you might can see already that production supervisors could also respond by simply raising prices. But in the Keynesian model, the assumption is that markets aren't clearing very well, and there's a lot of excess capacity everywhere. There's a lot of idle equipment and idle workers, and so in the Keynesian model, the response will be that they will hire workers. Those workers, of course, will get paid, incomes will rise, and the economy will grow. Now, the third possibility would be if aggregate demand was less than aggregate supply. So in this case, if aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, what would happen? Well, if you're buying stuff at a rate less than what you're producing it, then in that case inventories will increase. Production supervisors will walk through the warehouse and see all that inventory increasing, and so they will lay off workers. And of course, when those workers get laid off, they won't get paid, so income will fall and the economy shrinks. So those are the basic three rules. If aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, the economy is kind of in equilibrium. If aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, the economy expands. If aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, then the economy shrinks. Another way of thinking of it is that aggregate demand is the thing that dominates. It's the thing that causes the economy to do one thing or the other, and aggregate supply follows. So we named this model after Keynes, the Keynesian model, but frankly, if we hadn't named it after him, we could have called it the demand side model, since in this case everything depends on what aggregate demand is doing. Now the next thing you need to keep track of, another fundamental of the Keynesian model, is this idea of the multiplier. So what is the multiplier? Well, the multiplier is this idea that when you hired those workers, remember in that rule when aggregate demand was greater than aggregate supply and you went out and you hired those workers, then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what did those workers do with that money? Well, they would have most likely spent some of it, maybe all of it, but certainly they would have spent some of it, and in the process of spending that money they would have caused aggregate demand to go up even more. So in the following week, production supervisors would walk through their warehouses, and even though they have increased production, they would discover that sales have gone up again, because remember, those workers would have gotten paid, and the Keynesian assumption is, well, they get paid, they will spend some of it, and that spending is reflected in aggregate demand in the second round. So this multiplier is this kind of snowball effect that when you hire a worker, they go out and spend some money, which causes some other worker to be hired, who then in turn spends more money and causes another worker to be hired, and so forth. This is the idea of the multiplier. Now, one last thing that you might think about before we stop this short lesson is how can this model work when we have the basic classical model that says markets clear, and they reject this whole idea of the Keynesian model. And the difference in the assumptions of these two groups of economists has to do with whether or not the market's clear. I had a student one time ask me what it means to say market's clear. And all we're really talking about is that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, and you have an equilibrium price. So if markets do indeed clear, there aren't all these extra workers to hire. You know, when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, production supervisors can't go out into this great pool of skilled but unemployed workers to take up the slack. So in the classical model, what happens is that the production supervisors see this pressure in their firms, and their response is to raise prices because they are already producing at some high level and they can't easily increase production, so their response will be to raise prices. But in the Keynesian model, the assumption is always that there's lots of slack in the economy, lots of excess resources, and so it's really quite easy for the production supervisor to just go out and hire more workers. In my face-to-face classes, I usually ask the students to relay back to me scenes that they've seen from movies that are set in the Great Depression. If you've ever seen a movie set in the Great Depression, there is always a scene. In every movie I've seen, they have a scene like this where there's workers standing around. It's usually cold and usually rainy, and they're standing around outside the factory gates, and the foreman or the production supervisor walks up to the gate and cracks the gate open and says, you, and you 3 or 4 workers, you come in, you have a job today, and everyone else has to go home. So that's a kind of a classic vision of the Keynesian model that you see in the media all the time. But in the classical view of how the economy works, there might be people out of work, but there's some reason that they're not employed, like maybe the work is in California but they live in South Carolina, or maybe the work is in oil fields but their training is really in textiles, or maybe they have small children at home and they can't easily work the long hours that are needed, and so forth. So that's a sort of philosophical difference in the two approaches, and I hope you can appreciate how that would lead to very different ideas about how the economy works. Okay, so that's the end of the Keynesian fundamentals, and then next I'll show you how all this lays out in a graphical representation. All right, good luck.